Hey YouTube, my name is Chris Adams, and a few weeks ago I was searching for comparison videos between a Canon C100 Mark II and a Canon EOS 90D. I found a video about the 80D and I found a few B-roll comparisons between the M50 90D and the C100. For me though, I was looking for more of an in-depth video on how does the quality match up, how does the footage match up if you're using one as an A or B camera. And so, because nothing existed, I felt like I should do this video. Realistically, I need to do this comparison for myself anyway to see how this footage is going to compare, what are the workflow issues I might run into, and just kind of come to some conclusions so that when I'm out in the field working with these two cameras that I can know how to color grade them, how to match them, how to use them in that field. So I was planning to set this all up for myself and test them anyway. So I figured it might as well just hit the record button and upload these to the internet. So onto the setup. If I don't say otherwise, this is generally the setup we'll be using. I have a GVM key light off to my left here, your right. Behind me I have that same panel that's kicking out some blue RGB. I've got my LEDs. All of my audio will be going through the H6 recorder here with an NTG3 shotgun microphone. I know the C100 can take an XLR microphone directly in, but I wanted to keep it as even as possible. That way, if there is camera shot to camera shot, and I don't know if I'm going to talk on those or just have them be silent. But either way, if there is talking, that's the setup. I don't want to have the variable of the camera on there. I'll definitely compare the H6 to the internal recording on the C100, but I'll definitely call that out when I do it. The other thing is the lens I'll be shooting on, unless otherwise noted, is the Sigma 18-35 1.8 Canon Art lens. Great lens. That will probably be on both cameras. I'll switch that back and forth. The nice thing about that is I do have a filter that's a 3-stop ND filter, so that might help us be able to avoid using the C100's ND filters, because the stops there are 246 on the Canon C100. My filter on the Sigma lens is only a 3-stop filter, so getting that to match exactly. And even if I could get the stops to match, there's a difference in glass and everything else. So trying to keep it as comparable as possible. I might try to keep that 3-stop ND filter on the glass when I need it and switch from camera to camera with that, so that I don't have to use the internal ND. Maybe I'll bring that up as an example of, hey, here's what the internal ND filters look like on the Canon C100. But generally speaking, I'll try and avoid any differences like that. If you don't know yet and haven't figured it out, this intro I am shooting here is on the Canon 90D. And yeah, let's just jump right in. I feel like I've said that already because I jumped right into the setup, but now we're gonna go into the actual video. I imagine this video is going to get fairly long for me to cover the things that I have on my list. It's a pretty decent list, and I wanna get outside and shoot some dynamic range tests and all the other types of things. So hang on tight. I imagine this will be a long video when it's all done, and I don't know. So hang on tight. The first thing that was interesting to me, and I made this little graphic that you can check out, is the 90D is a 4x3 sensor. So it's actually almost a letterbox. Maybe it is letterbox, it's letterbox 3x2, whatever. It's 4x3. The 90D has a crop when you switch it to video mode. Obviously then it turns into 16:9. What was interesting for me is the Super 35 sensor on the Canon C100 is actually slightly wider because it's natively 16:9. So even though it's probably about a similar frame size, the 16:9 image is actually quite a bit wider. Before even starting the intro, I had both cameras up on a tripod and had them at similar lenses with similar framing and, similar focal lengths. And the Canon C100 was noticeably wider. That graphic might not make it look like there's much of a difference, but with a wider lens on the camera, a few millimeters is a pretty big difference. There is a nice thing about the C100, I guess. Your lenses will have a little bit wider look to them. So I know it's not close to 35mm, but it's definitely a slightly larger field of view than APS-C. To be fair to the C100, I will probably put this all into a 1080p timeline and keep it fair that way. If you're interested in a 4K comparison, I will probably put that in a future video where I shoot the 90D at 4K 24 and then shoot the C100 at 1080 24 up-res that to 4K and then compare the two side by side. I've done it a few times and the C100 actually up-reses to 4K pretty well. I've never compared them side by side yet, but I can do that in a future video if there's interest. This first shot here is the Canon 90D in 4K 24 frames per second, and we'll downsample that into 1080p 24, which is a lot like what the Canon C100 is doing anyway in the body. So this should be fairly similar in quality, ideally, if the Canon 90D is doing a good job at that. Keep in mind though that the 90D does have a 32.5 megapixel sensor or something like that. So it's doing some sort of down-resing, downsampling in the body already, even just to get the 4K. So we're just down-resing it again. So you're looking at really, to get full frame in this crop, obviously you're cropping the top out like you saw in that previous graphic. You're losing those top pixels to get to 16:9, but I would guess that your 16:9 pixels in the 90D are somewhere like high 28, 29s, high 20s, or low 30 something. So Canon's doing some sort of downsampling with this shot, but this is 4K 24 on the 90D. So now we're on the C100. This is obviously a 4K sensor, I think from the C500 if I have my information correct. That's been 4K down-res to 1080. So here we are. Something I'll note as we're checking out the beautiful, glorious footage here is in Canon log, I am like 3 or 4 stops overexposed on the meter for this to, I guess, feel like a good exposure to me. I'm blowing out the blue a little bit on my RGB meter here, but hopefully I can correct that in post-production. But this is it. We've got same lens. I will also mention I'm shooting at f4 here because I'm at ISO 850 instead of ISO 100, and I just want to be at that native ISO because, to be fair, the Canon's is 100 and I didn't want to use ND filters yet. So here it is, we're at f4, probably less blurry background now, but this would be, there's nothing in front of the glass and the image sensor at this point. I was gonna throw the 3-stop glass ND filter on it, but you know what, for science, I decided I would just stop the lens down a little bit. So this is what it looks like, 1080p, 24, and at f4. So here we are now at 2 stops of ND, and built into the Canon camera, we're shooting at f2 now instead of 4. So I'm guessing some of this is now more blurry than it was before. And how does it look? I think Canon's ND filters are pretty good, so they shouldn't affect or do any color shifting at all. My RGB histogram looks pretty good still. And yeah, I think this has a good cinematic feel to it, I think. We're just gonna say that because then it makes us feel better about hauling around a much larger camera than we would need to. What do you think? I've touched on some of the differences now at this point between these two cameras, but I wanna just go through as quickly as I can a list of what the differences are between these two cameras and why you might choose one over the other, or why you might choose both of them. Because I think that's why we're all here watching this video. And when we say we all, I know there's just 3 more of you, so welcome. It's nice to have you here. The first major difference for me in using these two cameras side by side is the native ISO on the C100 is pretty high at 850. That's kind of right in the middle of where I would normally be comfortable shooting. So it is nice, you get a really clean image at ISO 850. So the low light performance is pretty amazing at that ISO, and you can go without ND filters at that point and shoot fairly well into the evening. But it definitely is interesting because most of the cameras I'm used to, the native ISO is quite a bit lower than 850. So it's unusual, and just get used to not going below 850. The obvious next big difference between these two cameras is how you would rig them out for a professional shoot. A 90D or any DSLR mirrorless camera for that matter is really designed as a hybrid camera, right? That it can do video, but it can also take pictures. because of that, they tend to be small. They don't have a lot of screens and buttons and things like that. So you generally have to rig those out fairly significantly before they can really get the job done. For me, that's a little bit of an annoyance because there's a lot of extra cost in the rigging of a camera that you just don't figure until it's too late. You need an extra battery because the internal one doesn't quite last long enough. And so many other things that you want to be able to mount on the camera. If it doesn't have any mounting points, then you have to buy a cage for it, and obviously you know how all that goes. So the C100, the Canon Cinema line, and all the other cinema cameras for that matter, they're ready to go. You put it on a tripod and you can start shooting. So I think there's a big value in that we forget to calculate of what is the actual cost of rigging up a camera for external monitor, recorders, all the other things we do to get them actually ready to be a cinema camera, and how close would we have been to just buying a cinema camera with the money we end up spending rigging out our cameras. They look cool, some people don't agree with that, but they tend to look a little bit cooler when they're rigged out. In the end though, it's a little bit more work to have to do that, and if you want to take it apart to use it as a photo camera, then you have to undo all the rigging and stuff to get that back to its sort of hybrid nature. The Canon C100, as you already probably know, has built-in XLR inputs, which for a quick shoot when you need to just get on location and get running, built-in XLR is much nicer than having to run external recording and then sync everything in post, and all that can be cumbersome when you have a big project where you're having to sync a lot of files and the audio and video files aren't necessarily labeled or whatever when you're shooting them. So it's a little bit extra work in post-production. So the XLRs on the C100 is a big plus if that's something that you need. Right now I'm still on the H6, and this is what it sounds like. Fast, versatile, impressive. Whether capturing high-speed sporting events or simple everyday moments, the EOS 90D camera is engineered to deliver impressive results. Now we're over here on the Canon C100 with the built-in XLRs. Here we go. Fast, versatile, impressive. Whether capturing high-speed sporting events or simple everyday moments, the EOS 90D camera is engineered to deliver impressive results. Fast, versatile, impressive. Whether capturing high-speed sporting events or simple everyday moments, the EOS 90D camera is engineered to deliver impressive results. Fast, versatile, impressive. Whether capturing high-speed sporting events or simple everyday moments, the EOS 90D camera is engineered to deliver impressive results. So there's a few things that I wanted to mention that I think are something we can just kind of walk through as a list and don't really matter as much before we take these off the sticks here and start running around with the cameras and getting some more dynamic shots. The first thing is battery life. The Canon C100 has a pretty large battery by default, and you can buy an even bigger one. So you can shoot for hours on a Canon C100, and the 90D is pretty good actually, but I would say somewhere between an hour and a half you should expect to be replacing the batteries on the 90D. The C100 also has dual card slots for SD cards, so you can record the main shot to the first card and record a proxy to the second one. I don't know why you would ever do a proxy when you're shooting 1080p with modern computers. I don't think anything wouldn't be able to handle that anymore, but you can do that if you want. Some of the more interesting ones are continuous recording, where it will flip from one card to the next, or simultaneous, where you can record your footage to both cards at the same time. So if you're shooting a wedding or something like that where you need a backup while you're shooting, you can do that on the C100, and the 90D just has the single SD card slot. I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but the Canon C100 actually has pretty good and flat Canon Cinema picture profiles that you can't really get on the 90D. There are good ones out there like CineStyle and ProLoss that you should go check out. Google that. There's tons of other videos. I don't need to get into too much detail there. Those are great picture profiles, but the Canon log profile just seems to have a much better dynamic range. It's a little bit flatter, and it definitely gives you some more creativity in the color grading process. A nice little feature too is the Canon C100 has a Rec 709 preview LUT that you can put on the display when you're shooting in one of the Canon log profiles. So you can run the Canon log profile and check out what a Rec 709 LUT would look like before you get it onto your computer. So that's nice. Don't use it a ton, but I think it's a nice feature if you want to look at a less flat picture on the display, but then still have the freedom in the color grading process to work with that flat profile. I think the last thing I want to talk about before we go on the road with these two cameras is autofocus. Both of them have it. I've been using autofocus on the two cameras during this shoot, but Canon's autofocus is maybe 20 or 30% of the frame. The box is right here. So if what you're focusing on isn't right there, you're going to get issues. There's a couple of things you can work around. There's an autofocus stop button on the C100, so you can get your autofocus and then reframe your shot by stopping the autofocus. It's a workaround, it's okay. The C100 does not have face detect like the 90D does, and it does, I guess, have that without the eye detection if you use an STM lens. So you could get around that with an STM lens, but they don't have quite the same quality as the Sigma Art Glass or a Canon L series lens. So you get to pick your poison there of, do I want the best image quality or do I need autofocus? So if you really need autofocus and you need that face detection, you can get an STM lens and work around that with the Canon C100. But autofocus, comparatively speaking, the 90Ds is much, much better. It will actually grab one face and detect the eye. It will preview the next face in the screen if there's two people up, and when one loses, it's ready to grab the other one. It's very good autofocus. I don't think I've ever had any issues with the 90D unless there's really a lot of people in the frame, and then I would switch to manual focus. But again, as a videographer, that's pretty normal. For the autofocus, 90D takes a massive win in that category. All right, now it's time to get these cameras off the sticks and get them on the road. I want to check out how they do in daylight and see how the dynamic range is between the two of them, and then I'll find some areas where we can shoot in lower light and see what quality we can get in a darker scene between these two cameras. All right, let's head outside first and check out how the dynamic range looks like outside in full sun. I hope that was an interesting shot for everyone. As you can see, the C100 definitely benefited from having the extra stops of built-in ND filtration. I definitely used all 6 stops of the ND plus the 3-stop filter on the front to get some of the better shots that I was able to create while shooting outside. Obviously, if you had a more aggressive ND filter for the 90D or really any other DSLR without it, you probably could have created the same shot, but for this shoot, I only had that 3-stop Tiffen filter. So theoretically, I guess you could have created that same look, but the fact that it was right in the body, I could just turn it down when I needed to, and that was pretty amazing. So here we are in the low light shot. I'm in a basement, a dark basement here, no lights on. I have these lights on behind me here, actually behind me over here. I have these lights on, but they're not really providing any actual light. I think those are 5 or 10 watt bulbs, and so they're not really lighting me at all. So this is all just the ambient light from the basement window down here. On the 90D, which is over there, I am at a 50th of a second at f1.8, ISO 100. Over here, I've got 2 stops of ND on at f1.8 as well. ISO 850, so the native ISO. Like I've been saying, stay at 850, and it's pretty crazy that even down here without any lights, there's no key lights, there's no backlights, there's no other anything, that we're getting pretty good shots. Obviously, these really, really low aperture lenses help out with that quite a bit. Thanks for making it this far, everyone. I hope you enjoyed this video. Expect more things like this to come, and we'll see you guys on the next one. Later. Again, shooting at native eyes. Great. Moving on. This is obviously just 1080p. That's been down fancied into, did I say 1080p? 4K. Maybe I did.